Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Afternoon Intersections, where we connect God's Word to everyday life. Good afternoon and welcome to Afternoon Intersections, where the Word meets practical living, where it meets life. And so we want to today dig a little bit deeper in God's Word. We have a special guest with us today in the person of Dr. Norman K. Miles. He's currently the pastor of the Trinity Temple SDA Church in Newark, New Jersey. He's also served our church in many capacities as a conference president. He has served as a university professor at Andrews Theological Seminary, urban ministry and history. And so we're so glad that he is here with us today. He's been a blessing to my life and my family's life. He's been a mentor and a friend. He gave me my start in gospel ministry. I had the privilege to work with him as his assistant, where I learned so much about the ministry. And so I'm so glad a lot of those lessons and things he said back then still stay with me today. And so I'm so glad that he's here with us. He is married. He's been married for 52 years. He has 52 years of ministry. His wife, Dolores, they have 5 adult children and 3 grandchildren. And so we're so glad that he's with us today. We want to welcome Dr. Miles, Norman Miles, with us. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper in the message today that was shared, that you heard. So today in your sermon, Dr. Miles, you talked about a lot about Joel chapter 2 and talked about the Lord will pour out his spirit upon all flesh. And you also talked about, how God will restore the years that the locusts ate, right? And really you used that as the experience of Judah, the suffering, all of the struggle, the disaster, the lack of food. He used it as a parallel for the African-American experience, particularly in America. And you talked a lot about how the gospel was able to really impact the souls of Black people, even though they were in bondage. And so I want to ask the question, what do you think it was about the gospel message that resonated so deeply with them? And how was that able to provide such incredible hope and endurance and staying power in such a difficult time?
Well, I think the thing that does it all to begin with is the extreme honesty of the scriptures, because the scriptures tell everything. The scriptures don't leave anything out. And so the scriptures talks about, for instance, women who are having children out of wedlock, but God still blesses them. And even Mary, or in the case of other women who had children out of wedlock, or a Jesus born in poverty. I mean, you can't think of anything worse than being born in a barn and your first cradle is a cattle's feeding trough. And the children of Israel being led out of Egypt. They were slaves and had tremendous bondage. Or a Joseph who is betrayed by his own brothers, who is sold into slavery. I mean, this had to have resonated with people who were who thought about their own brothers, because actually the slave trade worked because Africans on the mainland and Europeans who were there, they worked together to produce this thing. It wasn't just the white man's doing. Everybody kind of had a hand in this. So, when you talk to a person who has been sold away from his family in Africa, and you tell him that there was somebody named Joseph who was sold by his brothers who were jealous of him, and he was in bondage, and he seemed to be doing pretty well, and then he was falsely accused, and he landed in jail, and things looked like they were going to do well for him, because there was a guy who got out and he said, "I'll remember you to the Pharaoh." And so Joseph is looking for the guy that any day somebody's going to come and tell him something. 2 years goes by and the guy has completely forgotten about Joseph. And at a time when Joseph must have been at his lowest ebb, God turns his fortunes entirely around and eventually allows him to put him in a position where he now sees his brothers subservient to him. I mean, just things like that. The Bible is so complete with the beautiful stories about the Bible are always stories that relate to the human condition. A David who is a boy facing a huge giant who has been a man who is trained in the arts of war, who has absolutely no chance.
Mm.
He doesn't even have a weapon. He has a sling and 5 stones, and that's it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And yet God uses that to knock the Goliath out, and David then takes his sword, and David must have been very strong because it was a huge sword. Takes his sword out of the scabbard and cuts his head off.
Mhm. Mhm.
Everywhere you look in the scriptures, even when masters tried to keep slaves talking about servants obey your masters, for this is pleasing to the Lord. There were these other texts and even in the stories, because that's what people picked up on easiest. There was always this undercurrent that said God is looking out for people who are in trouble.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I was watching the Black Church documentary on PBS this week, and it talked about how, the slave masters intentionally tried to take out portions of Exodus so that the black people wouldn't see that. But no matter, like you said, you just eloquently, they were parts of the Bible. They obviously did not realize how that would resonate with their experience. And you couldn't take out the cross or Jesus Christ.
Right.
And so I guess it's so powerful how the word of God just meets the human condition no matter where you are, and in so many different ways. I guess I also want to ask this question, in terms of how do you think, so there was a sense, you talked about identification with God who's looking out for the person that is suffering, and this idea of deliverance. How do you think the gospel shaped their perspective of God? So in one level I hear you talking about they seem as someone that's looking out for those who suffer, but were there any other ways or aspects of his character that you think open their hearts to him more?
Well, I think first of all,
Mm-hmm.
the greatness and the grandeur of God is something that everybody who lives close to nature sees. You should see that on a daily basis, the way the sun comes up and the way water flows in the rivers, and the way the way animals do whatever they're doing, and the way things grow.
Yeah.
Everything in nature points you to a creator.
Mm.
And I believe that's why in the book of John it says Jesus Christ is the light that lights every man who comes into the world. It's hard to be an intelligent thinking person and grow up in a natural environment and look around and say, wow, nobody built this stuff, but it's all here for us to enjoy and to experience. Well, obviously somebody had to create it. So it tells you something about the power of this God who and of course then when they did get little bits of scripture, you also hear about the love of God and the mercy of God. And we have to remember that our forebearers who were taught Christianity only got pieces. They got pieces of the Bible. They didn't have it all. And yet with those pieces that they got, God inspired other people to give them more. And it's hard to really conceptualize the relationship that people had in a world where they lived much closer to nature and lived much in an environment where there were fewer things to distract them from experiencing the divine. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
You live in a place where you don't have television, you don't have radio, you don't have news. Well, they have newspapers, but you can't read them because you probably don't know how to read.
Yeah.
There are very few things that you have to do except get up in the morning, eat, sleep, grow your crops, and go out and work and do whatever is required of you and try to stay alive. But in the midst of all this, when you go to bed at night and they close, you're in your cabin, you don't have glass at the windows, so they close so as soon as it's dark, I mean, you're in, you close the door, you close the wooden shutters. There's absolutely no light in there except if you've got a fire going in the fireplace.
Yeah.
And in the midst of all this darkness and quietness, as people drift off into slumber, you have this time to experience the divine, and you have the opportunity to experience God in a way that few of us do today because of our of our humdrum life of activity. Few of us take the time or are away from other things and other people
Mhm.
long enough to experience the divine. And when you hear some of these slaves talking about God talking to them,
Mhm.
I believe that God still does talk to you. And I can tell you, I had one experience that I know God spoke to me. I heard the voice,
Mm.
and I know it is.
Mm. Mm.
And I'll tell you, if you ever have it, nobody can tell you that it wasn't Him talking to you.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Right.
But it happened at a time when I was all alone, and I was out in a wooded area. There wasn't a soul out there but me.
Mm. Mhm.
And it is in those kind of circumstances that the divine can be experienced in ways that he can't be other places.
Mm.
And so I think just the fact that these slaves had such constricted life.
Mm.
I mean, the average slave didn't travel. The
Mhm.
average slave never traveled more than 2 or 3 miles from where he or she was enslaved. They didn't know anything about the
Mhm.
countryside too much or anything, unless they had a spouse that was on the next plantation a
Mm.
mile or two away. But beyond that, they didn't know. But in all of that, they could experience the divine in different ways than we can.
Wow. Wow. In some ways, what you're saying, them just being that close to nature had a different kind of impression where they could experience God in a deep, deep way. You know,
Yes.
that stands out to me. One of the things you talked about, in 2:18 says, "Then was Jehovah jealous for his land and had pity on his people." This idea of God,
Mhm.
even in that time, in Judah's history, and as we think about the Black experience, that God had compassion. His heart went out to them, right?
Mhm.
Which led me, you quoted a song, in your sermon that says, "I couldn't hear nobody pray," right? Which
Mhm.
we see that that music was a very integral part of the Black experience. From that experience, we hit songs like "Steal
Mhm.
Away to Jesus," "Swing Low," "Sweet Chariot," "Come and Let Me Ride," or "Wade in the Water," right? And I guess I was wondering, what role do you think, how formational were those songs for them? And then when I really looked up, I couldn't hear nobody pray. And in some ways, that song was a song of despondency, it would seem, about the hopelessness that they felt, but they were crying out to God. So I guess I'm interested to hear how do you think these songs impacted their faith, their walk? What do you think it meant for the experience for them as they were going through that?
Well, the black song is something that has been studied and is still being studied. Pardon me, I got a little cold and excuse me, this cough I'm
It's all right.
dealing with.
It's all
I'm
right.
sorry.
Mhm.
But the black song has always been more than music.
Mm.
Because in part of it is because of the African tradition.
Okay.
In Africa, music is a part of your experiencing the divine. You have to remember these were African people
Hmm.
who had Africanisms that came with them, and so they sang songs when they were working and so forth, and it was part of their tradition
Mm.
because it helped them. It helped them with their work, and it also helped them maintain a connection with the divine. Masters began to appreciate it because
Mm.
they felt like a slave who was silent was thinking,
Mm.
and thinking was dangerous. They didn't want slaves to be thinking.
Mm.
So a slave who was quiet, they wanted slaves to sing. But over time, the what we call the spiritual or the black song became a song of frustration.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm so sorry. A song of just like you look at the Psalms
Mhm.
and David, who wrote many of them.
Mhm.
Some of these psalms are psalms of joy, of enthusiasm, psalms of encouragement. Some of them are psalms that say, "I am really messed up."
Mm.
David says, my feet had almost slipped.
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
why is it that the good people, they're having a rough time, and the evil people, they just get away with everything. And so we are having that kind of thing with the black song as well. But the other part of the black song
Mhm.
is that it expresses the full range of emotions, but also expresses it was a signaling kind of thing.
Mhm.
Sometimes that couldn't hear nobody pray was not just a song of despair. I'm sorry, but sometimes it was a song of a message of encouragement. For instance,
Mhm.
many of the studies have indicated that one of the Africanisms that Black people brought with them was the sacredness of the pot.
Hmm.
You heard about that?
No, I haven't heard about that. No.
Yeah, the pot. Well, you're in the South.
Mhm.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever visited any of the older people who live out in the country?
I think so.
Have you ever visited somebody's yard and there was a big black pot sitting in the middle of the yard?
No, I haven't seen that. No. No.
Well, you're not far enough south then.
I got to go down to Mississippi, huh? Is that
That's
where?
around Mississippi where I started. But in some places in the South, and I bet you some of the people who are listening to us
Mhm.
have seen this.
Mhm.
Some of the old folks had a pot in the yard,
Mhm.
or sometimes they put a little small pot on the porch by the front door. It was said to be like a horseshoe, a symbol of good luck.
Mhm.
But in Africa, the pot was a sacred symbol, so that I've been to some places in West Africa where outside of everybody's home, there's a little pot by the door that has a little rice in it or something like that.
Mhm.
It is for the ancestors.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, nobody expects anybody to come and eat it, but the idea is this is to demonstrate to the ancestors that you are welcome here.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the interesting thing is that people thought that slaves thought that if you had a pot in the room when you were praying and so forth, that you couldn't be heard.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I used to wonder, well, why was that an issue? Because, and the reason it was because slaves didn't know how to pray silently.
Mhm.
We bow our heads, we pray silently, we think prayers. When they cried out to God, they cried out to God.
Yeah.
And so some of the things that they were crying out to God, they didn't want the master to hear.
Mhm.
And they believed that if that pot was in the room,
Mhm.
or if it was turned sideways, it would catch the sound
Mhm.
and the master couldn't hear.
Mhm.
Because usually they had these their own services in somebody's cabin or down in the woods somewhere.
Mhm. Mhm.
And sometimes the next day, they're kind of wondering, well, did somebody hear?
Mhm. Mhm.
And are we going to get whipped today?
Mhm.
Because the slave never knew when they were going to get beat.
Mhm.
And once they would go around, and somebody who worked in the house would, kind of get the temperature of what was happening in the master's head. And they start going around singing, couldn't hear nobody pray.
Mhm.
Couldn't hear nobody pray down yonder by myself. Couldn't hear nobody pray. And somebody else would pick it up. And it was a way of telling everybody the coast is clear. There's not going to be a problem. They didn't hear us last night.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it meant frustration on one end, but also meant, hey, we got away with that one.
Yeah.
So the black song was spiritual, but it was also deeply cultural and practical.
Mhm. 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 Wow. That's profound. So it was also a way of communicating, you know,
Absolutely.
to one another.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is there a song in your mind that encapsulates the Black experience during that time? You know, um, for you, and as I think about music, for me, whenever I'm trying to connect with God, it has a way of settling my heart, turning my heart to Him. If there's doubt or anxiety or whatever, there's joy. It's an expression of that. So even today, I see how comforting it must have been musically to their hearts even back then. But as I think about it, do you think there's a song? And there's so many, but that you think encapsulates um, their experience?
Well, the one I think of um, that encapsulates the slave experience, maybe,
Hmm.
was Go Down Moses.
Hmm.
way down in Egypt land and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. When
Mhm.
Egypt was,
Mhm.
when Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oppressed so hard they could not stand.
Yeah.
Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. So I
Uh,
think the
mhm.
experience of slaves,
Mhm.
for me,
Yeah.
that is one of the songs that really captures it. But I will tell you a song
Mm.
that I cannot hear without being reduced to tears.
Mm. Mhm.
It is a song that was written after slavery by a Black Methodist clergyman,
Mhm.
and the Oakwood College, Oakwood University Aeolians sing it every year at graduation. Beams of heaven as I go in this wilderness below, guide my feet in peaceful ways. Turn my midnight into day. I do
Mm.
not know
Mm.
how long it will be
Mm.
or what the future has for me, but this I know.
Mm. Mm.
Jesus leads me. I will get home someday. And this was a song that was written in the 1880s as blacks were trying to really assert themselves
Mm.
and get ahead and really and this and here this song says uh and you read the verses.
Mhm.
It says the last verse, it says right will often yield to wrong,
Mm. Mm.
but then it asserts that confidence that God will make it all right. But this I know,
Mm.
if Jesus leads me, I will get home someday. I do not know
Yeah. Yeah.
how long it will be, and I gotta stop saying it because I'm about to go now. Every time,
Yeah.
and when I go to graduations, and I remembered a few years ago, my wife and I didn't go to Oakwood graduation that year. We watched it online.
Mhm.
And of course, the Aeolians sang that, and they do a marvelous job. And my wife looked over me. I'm just start crying. I'm blubbering, and nose running. And so afterwards, she said, well, what's wrong with you? What got you going like that?
Mhm.
Well, first of all, I remember hearing my mother sing that song,
Mm. Mhm.
and my wife said, I didn't know that was so that's an old hymn. That's one of the oldest black hymns since you start having black written hymnologies.
Mhm. Mhm.
But but it talks about the black struggle
Mm.
and how things don't always go right, and blacks are constantly being pushed back. But this I know:
Mm.
if I just follow Jesus, I'm gonna get home
Yeah.
someday,
Yeah. Yeah.
despite everything.
Yeah.
And as I said, I cannot hear that song without being reduced to
Yeah.
tears. So if you want to see me being just so very undignified,
No, I hear you. I love that song. It's one of my favorite songs. I was just listening to that this week, actually. So, man,
yeah,
that's a beautiful song. I hadn't
I
really.
cannot, I cannot listen to it without being reduced to tears, whether I hear it in person or listen to a recording. It
Mhm.
just does something to me.
Yeah. I'd never put it in the context of the African American experience. I just thought it was an older hymn. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, when you go back and look at the lyrics,
Hmm. It makes sense.
that's exactly what it's dealing with. It's dealing with the African American experience post slavery,
Mm.
trying to move forward, and all the Jim Crowism, the
Mm.
lynching, all that stuff is involved in that.
Yeah. Which that's a really great segue because, in again, Joel talks about this idea that God will remove, I'll no more make you a reproach among the nations. And then in 225, he promises, he says, and ye shall eat plenty and be satisfied. Oh, that's the wrong one. And I will restore to you the years the locust hath eaten, and the
Hmm.
cankerworm and the caterpillar and the palmer worm and my great army,
Right.
which I sent among you. And so, we talked about this idea, this promise that's related to that, post slavery, the promise that God will bring about his restoration for a people, right? And so I guess I
Mhm.
want to ask, we saw that, the ending of slavery, the miraculous ending of slavery, right? Then we had to go through Jim Crow and then somehow we made it through that, and then we think about where we are today, in our world, and in some ways, people thought that with Barack Obama that we were like in a post-racial society, but really his presidency really stirred up really what was the underbelly in America and racism. And so we're dealing with the same issues in a modern way, the aggressive policing, the hyper incarceration, right? And so I guess I want to ask a question, what do you think, God's promise of restoration looks like, in the age of Black Lives Matter and, police brutality and Trumpism, what do you think it looks like?
Well, I'll tell you, I think that we are in an age where, if I look at it historically, I would say that we're in an age like the 1850s, late 1850s, early 1860s, where this country for many years had tried to ignore the issues of race and just kind of dance around them and so forth. And then and especially the issue of slavery, although it was certainly something that pulled the strings on all of the politics that involved the admission of new states like Maine and California and so forth. Finally, they had to just face it head on, and it resulted in a civil war that killed over 600,000 people. I think that we are at a similar spot. I'm not saying we're going to have a civil war, but I think that we are seeing a reckoning that has to take place. A reckoning that has to take place. The original sin of slavery and racism in America has never been fully dealt with. It's only partially dealt with. And we have tried to sweep it under the rug and so forth. But I believe that God has more that he intends for us to do and for us to experience. Some of that experience will be good, and some of that experience will be bitter. Right after the Civil War, we had a period of time of great promise. We call it Reconstruction. When you had Black people being elected to positions of prominence all over the South. I mean, you had in South Carolina, the director, the superintendent of schools in South Carolina was a Black man in the post Civil War era. You had Black senators blacks being elected to Congress and to the Senate. You had Blacks being in charge of various businesses, and you had all kinds of things happening that were of a positive nature. But it didn't last long because the powers, you see, we have to understand that the only reason we were brought to this country was to enrich other people. And as long as we can do that, we will be tolerated.
Yeah.
But when that doesn't happen anymore, brother, you got to go. Somewhere, go somewhere. We don't care where you go, just get out of here. But the problem that America faces is that Black people are such a part of the fabric of this country that it is impossible to extricate us. Most African Americans, unless you have parents that immigrated here from the Caribbean or South America, most African Americans can go back 4, 5, 6, 7 generations. We can go back more than most white people, unless their ancestors came over on the Mayflower shortly after. Of people who've been on these shores. We've been here a long time. And so even though when we have times of trouble, there's always a certain segment of the Black population that says, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm going to move someplace else. And the interesting thing is that Ghana and some other countries in West Africa are trying to encourage us to come on back. I mean, Ghana had a big celebration the other year, and they had made a big public apology to African Americans for being involved in the slave trade.
Mm.
and they're trying to say, "Come on back, come back home. We'll welcome you home. You know, bring your money with you."
Oh man.
That has always been alluring to some African Americans who said, you know, forget this. Why do I have to bother? So you've always had a segment of the population that have gone for some kind of nationalism. But the vast majority of African Americans have taken the position, this is where my fathers died. You know, this land belongs to me like everybody else. I ain't going anywhere. Um,
Yeah.
I believe that in some ways our best and our worst days are right ahead of us. I'll tell you what I mean by that, because I believe that God's going to give us a season of blessing. I mean, that's what the text talks about. I'm going to give you a season of blessing. And during that season of blessing, you know, I believe our people are going to see some great things happening, just like we had when we had a season of blessing in the 70s and 80s. And into the 90s, where things began to happen, things began to break for Black people. You know, you suddenly saw things, you see things on TV that you never saw. I remember the first time my wife and I saw on television a Black, a mixed couple kiss. And we laughed. We said, boy, half the television sets in Mississippi just went off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you look at these commercials, and so many of these commercials you have couples who have mixed marriages, and they have children who are obviously African American and Caucasian, and these are shown everywhere. And it almost gives the impression that this is sort of a normative thing in our society, and it is in some places. And I live in New Jersey, where we all kind of mix up with something here. You know, you can't tell who's what. But that's what's bringing up all this ire, and the resurgence of a much more belligerent white nationalism. This fear. Many years ago, the late Dr. Francis Cress Welsing came out with a theory called the Cress theory of color confrontation. If you've never read it, you ought to read it. It's an amazing kind of study. And basically, she was saying that the behavior of Europeans is based on the fact that deep down they realize that they are a minority population worldwide. And there's a fear of extinction, and so there's always attacking of people of color on the sexual level. For instance, she indicated that in 90% of all the lynchings, that the sexual organs were mutilated. It wasn't enough to just hung people, but they felt like they had to do this to men and women. Women were lynched too. And she was saying that her theory was that this came from an unconscious jealousy of the inability to produce a color, and the fear that they would be eliminated by virtue of the natural increase, and that if Black people and white people got together, that would accelerate that process. And one of the things that I saw a documentary not long ago, but it's Klan rally, and this guy bringing his little kid about 8 years old, got him in a little Klan outfit. The kid probably thought it was a Halloween costume, but he's teaching him hate, and he says, "I want to teach my son about our white culture and to maintain our white culture," because he's afraid. This guy's afraid that that's going to be lost. I believe that we're going to see more and more of that as that fear becomes more palpable among white Americans. At the same time, I believe we have many more opportunities for greatness and for excellence um, are expanding in such a way, not just because people are pounding on the door and saying, let me in, but because people who have gotten in the door have done well, and they're holding the door open, propping the door open for other people to come in. And so now it's not unusual. You can hardly go any place, and yes, the numbers are not like we'd like for them to be, but you can hardly go in any kind of industry, any kind of business or anything, and not see some black people there some way.
Yeah.
And the ones who are not there yet, they're on the way. I mean, even in sports that are considered non-black sports like hockey. I mean, you got blacks in the National Hockey League.
Yeah.
We're everywhere.
Yeah.
And that scares an awful lot of people.
Yeah. And I think, and just if we look in the political discourse in America, that fear is palpable. You know what I mean? And I think we see that happening today. One of the things that struck me also in the Black Church documentary was the role that the Black Church played, and even as it relates to the ending of slavery and some of the conversations that they had with politicians about that. And then, the 40 Acres and a Mule really originated with them. That was kind of the genesis of it. And so, then of course we kind of see that evolve, the Black Church and the civil rights movement, right? And particularly, so this question I want to get at is this idea, how do we engage as Christians in the political discourse without losing an eternal perspective and at the same time not becoming hateful and militant? And part of why I ask that too, because I think a lot of times when we think about Martin Luther King, I think we forget that he was a premillennialist, right? He engaged racial issues in America believing that things will get better before God comes, right? And so we understand from an Adventist eschatology perspective that things will get worse, then, we'll have this age of God's reign, right? So how do we engage? I think in some ways, I wonder if, is it a legitimate approach that, hey, we're going to really change? Should we really expect that? Not that we shouldn't engage, but should that be the end goal? And how do we engage in that and, without losing that eternal perspective? You understand, what I'm saying?
Sure. Let me go back to my message a little bit to what I was seeing in Joel. God promised the people of Israel who have been suffering this tremendous oppression. God says, I'm going to give you a season where you're going to get back all that you lost. That was not the end game. That was a season. And I believe that God is going, and one of the things that the Lord has told us to do is, Jesus said, do business until I come. So we got to do the business of the world, the business of justice, the business of truth telling until Jesus comes. And I believe that God is going to make things better, and then they're going to get worse.
Okay.
I believe that Joel, that the prophecy of Joel, remember the prophecy says that after these things, after things get really good, after you start getting back the restoration and so forth, then I'm going to pour out my spirit upon all flesh. We have tended to look at it as the thing where things are getting really, really bad, and then God pours out his spirit upon all flesh. That's not what I'm reading Joel saying. Joel is saying that I'm going to do the things that need to be done to create a better playing field for you. And then I'm going to pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And bring about the spiritual revival. Then all hell is going to break loose. But I think that for me, the church has to work to help bring about the season and recognize it as that, the season, not the end game, because the end game is not here. But the end game is a season where God that makes things, that puts things in a way that God can do his best work. And I know we black people tend to feel like God does his best work when we're in trouble. Sometimes. But God actually does his best work when things are going pretty well before the trouble begins. You remember that when Joseph was in Egypt, the message is You're going to have 7 years of plenty.
Mm-hmm.
You have 7 years to get ready, because year number 8 is going to be the beginning of hell.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have 7 years that will be so bad that you'll forget about the 7 good years that you had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I believe really that as we look eschatologically,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm understanding Joel properly, and I think I am,
Mm-hmm.
that God is going to give us as a people
Mm-hmm.
a season of clear shining for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the time when he will pour out his spirit, and in a way that Ellen White talks about this outpouring of primitive godliness like we haven't seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So our end game must never be, well, we're going to create heaven on earth. Our end game is we're going to do God's business so that God can it can set the stage
Mm-hmm.
for his best work to be done before the time of trouble really does come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you look biblically, every time there's been a time of trouble, there was a time of prosperity before that happened.
Yeah. You do see that. And then kind of coming down to the close here, I was thinking about you talk about, and you mentioned it here, this idea of he will pour out his spirit on all flesh, right? So we kind of see that God has, even beyond the material and the physical world, he has a deeper goal, right? That is eternal, right? This idea of pouring out his spirit. And we see that it's on all flesh. So it's going to be multicultural, multi-ethnic, it's not going to be gender specific, right? And so, how do we prepare ourselves for that outpouring of the spirit? What do you think that looks like? And yeah. And is it possible, my last part to that is how, is it possible that we can become too narrow in our focus, on just us as a people, that we miss God's larger purpose of saving and bringing people everyone into his kingdom, So there's a threefold question there.
I'm absolutely well. I'm gonna start with the last one, and if I lose my way coming forward,
okay.
But Ellen White says, and I should have brought. If I'd known you were going to ask that question, I would have had the quote. You look it up somewhere in the index that when the Holy Spirit is being poured out, it will be falling on some people and they won't even recognize it. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it's going to be a day of Pentecost where boom, everybody gets it, and it will be something that is poured out in such a way that if you're not spiritually attuned, you could miss it. You could miss it. Now, that brings me to the point where I think Black people, who I'm speaking to mostly, have got to. We are a people who have been a religious and a spiritual people. It has been our sustenance and our strength over the years. But we're dealing with a generation now that is becoming more and more unchurched and more and more disinterested in things of religion. And we do that at our peril. We do that at our peril. Because I think what we have got to recognize now is that if there was ever a time when we needed to be more spiritually aware, now's the time. Now's not the time for us to get absorbed in things. Now's not the time for us to get absorbed even in church, in things that are traditionally churchy. If there's one thing I've learned from COVID, is that I don't need my church building. A few years ago, I was talking with a young man. He said, "Oh, and I thought he just had the enthusiasm of youth and a little nuts." He said, I think we should just sell our churches and just rent buildings, don't have all that upkeep and so forth. And I think the gospel will go further. I said, "Yeah, you're going to take us back to the first century." Well, yeah, but did the gospel go faster? Yeah, well, you got a fair point. But look, I have been locked out of my church for almost next month. It'll be a year. When we closed the doors, I went on air, and I told them we think we're going to be closed for 2 or 3 weeks.
Mhm.
It's been a year,
Yeah.
but I'm I'm talking to my people on prayer meeting on Zoom, and whereas before I had a little handful of people that would come, now we have large numbers of people who get on there. Because coming to prayer meeting was, I mean, there were times I'd sit there and 2 or 3 people would show up. I'm sitting there waiting on the rest of them to show, and nobody's gonna come. Don't let it be a stormy night. Nobody's gonna come. I'm there by myself. Couldn't hear nobody pray. But what we're doing now, just like what you and I are doing,
Mhm.
what I'm doing, being able to preach at your church without having to get on a plane or get in the car and drive to Nashville and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
These are things that are enabling us to push the gospel out in ways that are new and exciting. I don't think we've begun to even we just begin to tap
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
potential of what we have here
Mhm.
to reach people.
Mhm.
And I think for those of us who have a tradition,
Mhm.
a spiritual tradition, we have a head start. We do.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean anything really,
Mhm.
because we can take it for granted that we know it all.
Mhm. Mhm.
We got God all sewed up to ourselves. We understand about spiritual things,
Mhm. Mhm.
just like the ancient Jews did. They were God's people, and God just spoke through them, and the Messiah was just going to come to him. Messiah wasn't really interested in other people. Somebody could join if they wanted to, but
Mhm.
Messiah wasn't going out looking for other people.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And part of what we have got to do is to broaden our understanding of the love of God.
Mhm.
I find myself, as I've gotten older, every so often I remind myself he is not willing that any should perish.
Mhm. Mhm.
Some will, obviously,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
not because he wants them to.
Mhm.
God's way is he wants everybody to be saved.
Mhm. Mhm.
That really throws me because there's some people I don't want to be saved. I got to be honest
Yeah.
with you. I mean, you
Yeah.
think about some of these people, some of these political leaders and these historical figures in the past, and people that are even going on now who are doing terrible things, who are killing thousands and thousands of people and subjecting people to terrible misery. And God wants to save them?
Mhm.
Why?
Mhm. Mhm.
What's the purpose?
Mhm.
It is because God does not think like human beings.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
It's because God's got a mind that can embrace all of humanity with its good parts and with its ugly parts.
Mhm. Mhm.
And he can say, I will forgive the sin
Mhm.
and I will save the sinner.
Mhm.
We often talk about hating the sin and loving the sinner, but most of us have a hard time with that if we ever accomplish it. We
Mhm.
hate we may not hate the sin so much, but we hate that sinner really,
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
And so I believe that God just wants to do, he wants to do something with us if we will let him.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that's the place that you as a clergyman and other church members have to remind ourselves that the church is relevant,
Mhm.
that the church is important to keeping us encouraged and built up. But that in the end, it's not about the building, it's not about the choir, it's not about the songs we sing. It is about the God who loves us and who is not willing that any should perish. And if we can ever get it into our heads that we should even want our enemies to be saved,
Mhm.
then I think we'll be there.
Yeah. 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 That's so true. And I mean, you really underscore it. I mean, the love of God is powerful, and that transforms our hearts, our families, our lives, and it will bring people to a saving knowledge of him. I really appreciate everything you've shared today. I don't know. I've been blessed by the conversation, and I pray that those who are watching this have also been blessed and that you've grown, and we see how the word intersects with everyday life. Thank you so much, Dr. Miles. I don't know if you have any final words or comments that you want to share.
Oh wow.
You don't have to, no pressure.
I'm afraid to talk because I'm still struggling with this little throat thing. I don't have COVID, but I do have.
Well, praise God
I
for
do have something
that.
going on with.
Yeah. No, I
Well,
appreciate. Yeah.
I guess as a closing thought for me,
Mhm.
I just want to say that Black History Month
Mhm.
and Black history teaches us how fundamental God has been in our experience,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that we discard him at our peril.
Mhm. Mhm.
We discard him at our peril.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, there are so many of us who are putting confidence in the government,
Mhm.
in protests, in economics, and so forth. And all of those things have their place.
Mhm.
But those things have worked because God has been the one behind the scenes making them work. And by the way, the economic power that most Black people got in our business, our first businesses were started in churches.
Mhm.
The insurance companies and the Black banks and so forth, most of them got started in churches, and their first customers were churches.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, you look at our entertainers, most of our great entertainers got their start singing in church choirs.
Mhm. Mhm.
And even in the hip hop generation, when a lot of people have taken their cues from the street, there's still a lot of people, and they don't let you know it, but there are a lot of people in the hip hop revolution
Mhm.
who used to go to church,
Mhm.
who got their first start in front of an audience at a church. Now they don't talk about it as much as some of the other folks used to do because that doesn't fit their persona as a hard rapper and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is, a lot of them did.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we dare not forget the fact that you can't even understand Black history unless you understand the role that religion has played in it.
Mhm. Mhm. That is so true. That is so true. That is true. Thank you so much again, Dr. Miles. And we got to have you back again soon, right?
Anytime you want me to come, I'll come anywhere that you want me to come.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, everyone, we just want to thank you for watching today. Until next week, this time, may God continue to keep and bless you and your families.
Thank you for staying by for Afternoon Intersections. Until next time, may you continue to reflect, apply, and live Christ's words.